Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the A-Pod. Fun chats, fun topics, fun people. We bring it to you every single Wednesday on msgnetworks.com and on iTunes. My name is Arda Ocal. I am your host. Thank you very much for subscribing, commenting, leaving a star rating on iTunes. That helps their backstage algorithm so that more people can find the podcast. The A-Pod. Hashtag the A-Pod on Twitter. You can follow me at ArdaOcalTV. Send me some tweets. Send me some comments on who you would like to hear as a guest on a future episode of the A-Pod. Last week was another three-peat, a triple threat, if you will. 3 guests on the A-Pod last week. You can check out who we brought on for some great fun conversations. Check the podcast feed. And by the way, we're also on Google Play. I should mention Google Play in that spiel that I do. I got to make sure I add it. This week, we will be bringing you another bonus episode. Not sure if it'll be 3. It might be a second bonus episode, but it's going to happen. So congratulations. You did it. You have demanded a bonus episode this week, and you shall receive. You are welcome. All of you are very welcome. What should we talk about before we get to our guest? Oh, I did an interview with Kenny Anderson. Mr. Chibs, he has a documentary out. It is in written form. You can find that at msgnetworks.com. That guy has had a life, man. Wow. And that documentary really goes through his entire life. All the ups and downs, the fame, the celebrity, the DUIs, the financial troubles, family troubles, abuse. It runs the gamut. And what he does today. It's actually a great story. In terms of how it ends and where he is at in his life. It's good to see that he's doing well based on what he's gone through in his life, and this documentary, as he mentions in the interview, was very therapeutic. So definitely go and check that out if you're ever a fan of Kenny Anderson when he was playing for the Nets. He played for several teams in the NBA. Check out that interview. It is at msgnetworks.com. Coming soon, I will have an interview with Greek record holder in the 10-kilometer run, Alexi Pappas. She has a new movie out called Tracktown, which is coming out this week. It is about an Olympic runner that suffers an injury and has to face real life head on. And she says in the interview that you will get to check out at msgnetworks.com later, that's very realistic. And she herself is an Olympian. She competed at the Rio Olympics for Greece, though she is American. She has an interesting story. It's really cool to hear her journey as an athlete, but now trying to transition to becoming an actor. And this film, Tracktown, she actually wrote it, she directed it, and she starred in it. So that's a lot of work. So kudos to her, and that interview will be up on Friday at msgnetworks.com. Now, we will have a bonus episode of the A-Pod that will also drop on Friday. Let's shift to boxing for a second. Saul Canelo Alvarez had another unanimous decision victory this past weekend over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. It definitely wasn't the best fight at all. Canelo pitched a shutout, and really anybody who paid money to watch this, I watched it out somewhere, but anybody who actually paid money to watch this fight basically paid money to see the setup of a fight they actually wanted to see. So I understand the whole Cinco de Mayo, prominent Mexican fighter versus prominent Mexican fighter, the pride of Mexico, who will be Mexico's greatest fighter. I understand all of that. I get the business end of it. I get the promotion end of it. But man, some fans were definitely left feeling disgusted at the end of this fight. It really wasn't a fight. It really shouldn't have been a fight that we saw, but Canelo is a draw, and we care about Canelo's. Many boxing fans care about Canelo's fights, but many fans were disappointed after this fight because it really was a non-factor. And really, the moment you wanted to see was afterwards when Canelo finally said, "Yes, I will fight Gennady Golovkin." And then Golovkin came into the ring, and Max Kellerman was there, and he interviewed both of them, and they both gave sound bites, and they both said, "I'm ready for this fight. It's signed, sealed, delivered." And Oscar De La Hoya and Bernard Hopkins are in the ring, and they're smiling because they know the dollar signs are rolling in, or the dollar signs are floating above the ring right now, and people are probably already putting aside $80 or $100 or whatever this is going to cost, and it's going to be a huge boxing fight. It's going to be in the millions in terms of buy rates. But for the Chavez-Saul fight, or for the Canelo-Chavez fight, I'm not surprised, and I empathize with people who bought it and are not happy right now. Totally understandable. Completely understandable. Some people would say that's boxing. Hey, sometimes you're going to get crappy fights. Understandable. But this one, really, other than the Cinco de Mayo, the Mexican warrior angle, I really just wish that Triple G and Canelo happened sooner. And now, since that has a September time frame, the Conor McGregor Floyd Mayweather fight might have to move, or might happen later or sooner, maybe later. And truthfully, let's put this into perspective, because we all know that boxing and MMA have different business models. The UFC operates like the WWE. It is essentially a monopoly. Bellator is a second promotion that is out there. They're coming to MSG late in the summer. They are a viable promotion. People do make money there, but the UFC is the top dog in mixed martial arts. Nobody is disputing that, to the point that people often call the sport of mixed martial arts UFC. It's sort of like calling a Q-tip a cotton swab. Zamboni is the brand of the ice cleaning machine. That's how recognizable UFC, those three letters, are. Boxing, on the other hand, has several top promoters. You have Top Rank, you have Golden Boy, you have Floyd Mayweather, you have Don King. There's several top promoters, and unfortunately, in that scenario, in boxing, a lot of the top fights don't happen as early or as timely as you want them to. That's why we did not see Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao in their primes, or in 2009 when it was first spoken about. Yes, it still broke box office records, but they were both at the tail end of their careers, and realistically, we didn't get both of them in their prime, and being able to call either one the best in the world at their prime. Even though many would still call Floyd Mayweather the best fighter ever, or the best fighter of this generation, a lot of it has to do with that zero in the loss column. So for him to come out of retirement now to face Conor McGregor, this is monumental on the business end, because now the UFC is involved. And public interest is through the roof for this fight. And a lot of combat sports purists are saying, well, this is besmirching the good name of combat sports. But is it though? Because at the end of the day, combat sports is about making money. And Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather are each probably going to make at least $100 million all in. Their base salary, their advertised money, their sponsorships, whatever else, appearances, all in, probably more than $100 million. And the pay-per-view buy rates is probably going to be at least 3 million, if I were to guess, maybe even 4. People are going to be interested in this fight. They're going to want to see Conor McGregor get into the ring. Even if it's a boxing fight, doesn't matter. Floyd Mayweather could win, doesn't hurt Conor McGregor's legacy. He's just $100 million plus richer. So that's my rant about the state of boxing and everything. At least we're getting Triple G and Canelo now, soon, in September, after the summer's over. And we're probably going to get Floyd and Conor at some point as well. So there you have it. Our interview today, speaking of boxing, somebody who has called many a boxing fight and has called pretty much everything else. He is one of the greatest broadcasters alive today. He is the only current broadcaster who is currently calling all 4 major sports. He does commentary for hockey, for football, for baseball, and for basketball. His name is Kenny Albert. Of course, the Albert family, legendary in the broadcasting business. This is a fun conversation, especially for me, because I'm in the broadcasting business, so it was very easy to ask Kenny questions, and he's very good at obviously he's a fantastic talker, but he's very insightful, which I liked. He gave a lot of insightful answers. So anybody listening to this who aspires to be a broadcaster or has ever been curious about the broadcast world, particularly play-by-play, will definitely enjoy this conversation, because we dive into a lot of facets of preparing for a game and calling a game, and what's the difference between calling a game on radio and television. These are all questions that Kenny Albert answers in this conversation. It was a very fun one. It was also a very interesting one. So enjoy this conversation with Kenny Albert here on the A-Pod. So here, sitting at the same place we did the interview with Dave Maloney, now we're doing it with his broadcast partner on the New York Rangers radio calls, Kenny Albert. The first thing I want to say, Kenny, is you can't have every job. Okay? Like, you got to give...
I'm good with you holding on to all yours.
Is there any... I know this is a funny question, but is there any sport you're bad at? Be honest.
Yes.
Okay, what is it?
When I was working in D.C. in the early to mid-'90s for a cable station, Home Team Sports, and I was doing the Capitals games at the time with Craig Laughlin, who's still down in D.C. and does a great job. And then I would also do some college sports, college basketball, lacrosse, soccer. They had the rights to a couple of college conferences, the ACC, the CAA, and I was once assigned to do college wrestling. And this is the real wrestling, not the WWE, WWF. This is what you see in the Olympics, in college, high school. And I studied for days, and I spoke to a couple of wrestlers on the phone who had done television, and I tried, and it just didn't seem to soak in. Luckily, I had a good partner with me, so I was like the traffic cop. Okay, here's Arda Ocal, record of 15-0 from Toronto, Ontario, senior here at North Carolina. It was down at UNC. And then I would just let my analysts go, and I really had no clue what I was watching.
Thank you for the padded record, by the way, 15-0. I appreciate that. So, and thanks for that honest answer. I actually wasn't expecting that. When did you? Let's dial it back though. Let's talk about. I mean, you grew up in a very famous broadcast family. When did you know that you were going to follow in the footsteps?
Believe it or not, when I was 5, I received a tape recorder for my birthday from my parents, a toy tape recorder. And really right from that time, growing up around broadcasting, living obviously with my father from the age, when I was born through 18, when I went off to college, and his 2 brothers, my uncles, who were also, at the time when I was growing up, they were doing hockey and basketball and boxing. So I was just surrounded by it, and it just seemed like so much fun. I was never told you have to do this, forced to get into broadcasting. It was really all I ever wanted to do. Now, I did some writing as well. I did some sports writing in high school and college. I was the sports editor of the high school newspaper, wrote for the college paper. I enjoyed that as well, and I think that actually was a good learning ground as well prior to getting into professional broadcasting. But I was 5, and I would set up my bedroom like a TV or radio studio. I had the desk, and then the bed in the middle, and the TV at the other end. And I still have these notebooks and storage and cassette tapes, and I would just announce games off the TV. And when I was old enough, I would start to bring a tape recorder to real games, whether here or Shea Stadium, for example, and got really lucky in 10th grade. A small cable outlet on Long Island, Cox Cable, came to my high school to film a girls' basketball game. And they were just going to show the video, show the game without announcers, with natural sound from the crowd, the 50 people that were in the gym. And the athletic director of my high school, who I was friendly with because I covered the teams for the paper, I did some of the public address announcing, he introduced me to the producer, a gentleman named Roy Menton. And I said, I'll volunteer if you want somebody to announce the game. And he said, sure. And he clipped on a mic like the one I'm wearing right now with you.
Yeah.
And I announced the game, and I got his phone number after the game. And 10th, 11th, and 12th grade in high school, I wound up doing hundreds of games for him. I would bring my friends as the color analysts. And it was every sport. It was basketball, hockey, baseball, football, soccer, lacrosse, everything but wrestling.
Yeah.
And it was just such a great experience just to get those reps. And I felt like going into college, I had so much more experience than anybody else my age because of these hundreds of games that I did for Cox Cable on Long Island.
Wow. So what did your father say to you when you said to him, I want to follow in your footsteps, I want to be a broadcaster?
I don't know if I ever really said it. I think he probably knew because I would carry this tape recorder around. And also I did the stats for him at
Oh, you did?
Rangers games, Knicks games, football games. So I always tagged along. And I was the oldest of 4, so I kind of had the advantage as far as going on road trips. My younger sisters and brother, they would start going on trips, but they were 5 and 6 years younger than me. So I started at an earlier age, so I would keep the stats for him. And things would just sink in via osmosis. It was more what I learned from observing and watching than things he actually said. But, I think, and I was kind of quiet back then, maybe didn't verbalize that this is absolutely what I wanted to do, but I'm sure he had a pretty good idea. And then in college, I went to NYU here in New York, and we had a basketball team, Division III. We didn't have hockey. Well, we had a club hockey team, which I played on, but as far as broadcasting, we had the basketball team, and my friends and I would work those games as well.
So I want to ask that, actually. How far did your playing career in any sport go?
One of my career highlights as far as playing sports was, and again, I wasn't very good. I played club hockey in high school, club hockey in college, which was a lot of fun. When the Rangers and MSG used to hold the Christopher Reeve charity game here at the Garden in the late 90s, I had the good fortune of being invited to play in that game along with a number of other media members. And I scored a goal, and Wayne Gretzky was on the Rangers at the time, and he was watching the game. All of the players were at the game in the stands, and he actually came up to me after the game and said, "Hey, nice goal."
Nice.
So that was
How do you top that?
That was quite right. How do you top that? Exactly.
It's funny you mentioned Christopher Reeve, because I mean, obviously one of my co-hosts is Will Reeve, his son, and
I remember Will. He was just a young boy at those games when I think it was 4 or 5 years in a row when the Rangers held those games for Christopher's charity, and it was tremendous. There were 15,000. I got to play in front of like 15,000 people at Madison Square Garden. It was crazy.
I asked him this question, and I'll ask you the same question, because I mean, obviously he went into broadcasting. He has no desire to be an actor. But I always asked him,
Nor do
was
I.
it difficult to, yeah, good to know. I asked him, I said, do you ever feel like you had to jump out of your father's shadow because he's a celebrity? And I guess I want to ask you that too, because but you're directly following in your father's footsteps, and your father is a legend in broadcasting. So when you started out, like, was that in the back of your mind, or did people bring that up?
Not too often. Maybe behind my back they did, but I felt one of the best things that happened to me was I moved out of New York for my first 5 years. My first job, and I would never trade these 2 years in for anything. It was such a great experience. I was hired by the Baltimore Skipjacks of the American Hockey League. They were the Washington Capitals affiliate at the time, and I was hired in June of 1990, right out of college, to be their radio broadcaster. And you also handled so many other tasks in the office: marketing, sales, public relations. But my main job was to broadcast the games on the radio. And again, it was such a great experience, working 80 games a year for 2 years, traveling on the bus with the team, 8, 10-hour bus rides, being a part of that group, and just learning and getting the reps. And then I wound up at Home Team Sports, as I mentioned earlier, with the Capitals for 3 years, and I loved it down there. I was working in the NHL at such a young age. I filled in on NBA and Major League Baseball games, and it was terrific, and never really thought about moving back up here. And then the Ranger opportunity came up in '95 when Howie Rose moved to Islanders TV. But I think the 5 years away, and I guess out of the shadow, so to speak, maybe allowed me to sort of form my own identity when I worked down in Baltimore and DC.
Did it help to, like, by moving away, people said, "Oh no, he's just not riding coattails. He's moving, and paying his dues."
Perhaps. I know there are some that have the opportunity to start right in New York or in Philadelphia or Washington or Boston or in a big city, but the path that I took, again, I wouldn't trade that in for anything.
Was it always hockey? Like, let me fill a couple holes here. What was your favorite sport growing up to watch?
Growing up, my favorite sport was hockey. Okay. Now, I loved all sports. The others were not too far behind. So
I think you have to say that because you call all 4 major sports.
Right. So it wasn't like hockey was up here and the others were down here. I loved them all. Hockey was probably a little bit ahead of the others as a youngster growing up, and I played hockey more than the other sports. That was my goal, was to do hockey on the radio when I was in high school and college. That was all I wanted to do. I never really focused on the other sports as far as the future. Now, when I was working for Cox Cable, as I mentioned, I did all these other sports, so I had experience with so many of the others. But my main goal was to do hockey, and at the time, football wasn't even on the radar because you had CBS and you had NBC, who had done the NFL for 30 or 40 years at that point, and all of the veteran announcers had been at their various networks for 15 or 20 years, so that wasn't even a thought. And then when I was doing hockey in Washington in '94, late '93 into '94, that's when Fox acquired the NFL rights, and all of a sudden there was this new network out there, and many of us heard through the grapevine that they wanted to hire some younger announcers, along with some veterans, Pat Summerall and John Madden and Matt Millen and Dick Stockton, but they also wanted to hire some, quote, younger guys. And myself and Joe Buck and Tom Brenneman, for example, we were all sort of in the right place at the right time, and all of a sudden we were broadcasting NFL games. I was 26, I think Joe Buck was 25. So that wasn't even a thought, just because most of the NFL announcers were 40, 50 years old. You wouldn't even have envisioned that happening. But when Fox acquired those rights, it kind of opened up this whole new world for a number of us.
Let's tie a bow on the Washington. What years were you in Washington? 90 to 95?
3 years. So, Baltimore for 2 seasons,
Okay.
90 to 92. And then with the Capitals, 92, 93, 93, 94, 94, 95.
So that's around the time the Redskins won the Super Bowl, right, in 92?
Redskins won a Super Bowl. I was there. I was actually at the game as a fan when Cal Ripken broke the record for consecutive games played. Camden Yards was built while I was living in Baltimore, so that was fun to watch the development of what I still think is one of the greatest ballparks in America. So it was a great sports area, it really was. And the Capitals at the time were a really good team. They lost to the Rangers in the second round in '94 when the Rangers went on to win the Cup. But ironically, in the first round that year, and I called the games, that was the only time the Capitals to this day have ever beaten the Penguins in a playoff series. Pittsburgh's won 9 out of 10 as we speak, while they're currently playing right now in the second round. And Jim Schoenfeld, who's with the Rangers, assistant general manager, he was actually the head coach of that Capitals team.
So I want to bring this back. You mentioned Joe Buck, and one of the things he talks about in his book is he started in St. Louis, then went national, and one of the biggest criticisms he always gets is, hey, you don't cheer for the home team anymore, or you hate my team. That's like a prevalent thing. So how often do you hear that when you're doing national games?
It's funny, Joe and I were texting. He's a huge hockey fan, and he's a
big Blues guy,
St. Louis
right?
Blues fan. He's a season ticket holder, and I was working a couple of the Blues games earlier in this round, and he was texting me on his couch watching the games. I remember back in the 80s hearing Al Michaels and Bob Costas tell similar stories about working a World Series game or an entire World Series. And at the time, without the internet, no email, they would get letters. 500 letters from this city, 500 letters from that city. Why do you hate us so much? And I know Joe goes through it, and to a lesser extent, I'll get tweets sometimes, in the age of social media. But I know, for example, that Joe does not root against any teams. Troy Aikman's not rooting for or against the Giants or Eagles when he's doing a Cowboys game. But I understand that the fans of those teams might perceive it that way because they're listening to the game or watching from their perspective. It's funny, I'll get some tweets from certain cities if I'm working a national hockey game, for example, regarding my, quote, hatred of their team, which is the furthest thing from the truth. I think, Arda, the main reason why sometimes you hear those, those thoughts from fans, they're so used to watching their home announcer, the local announcers. And I get it because I do the Rangers locally, and Joe used to do the Cardinals locally in St. Louis. So when the playoffs come and after the first round, they're not hearing their local announcers anymore. They're getting the national broadcast where you have to play it right down the middle. So maybe you're not praising their team as much or you're giving too much praise to the other team. But fans are very provincial, I get it, and they're so used to watching their announcers on their games.
And there could be a situation, or there may well have been, where you're the Rangers guy and you're very excited when the Rangers score on the Rangers radio broadcast, but then you go on NBC and you're doing a national game and the Rangers are involved, and you can't be like that.
You know what? And you have to remind yourself, it's tough because sometimes I might be doing a Rangers game on the national broadcast with Joe Micheletti, for example, who's another Ranger announcer. And I think the biggest compliment we received a couple of years ago when the Rangers played the Flyers in the first round, one of the Flyers announcers actually came up to us the next game and said, I just want to let you know you guys called it very fairly right down the middle. And that's from
cool.
the Philadelphia perspective. But you do have to remind yourself that when you are a local announcer from one team. I called Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final in 2014. Doc Emmerich had a family funeral to attend. So I called Game 1 of the Stanley Cup on NBC. It was the Rangers against the Kings. It wasn't two neutral teams that I'm never involved with. So I really had to remind myself that day, you have to get as excited on Kings goals as you do for Rangers goals.
Did you hear about it after the game?
No, not really. I didn't hear too much about it. So I guess that's
so
a good. I guess that's a good thing.
So give me some of your highlights then as a hockey announcer before we get to the other sports.
Right, and I get this question a lot. So as far as hockey, there are a number of them, and I'll have to start with '94. I was not working here yet. I was with Washington, but I had the opportunity to call the Stanley Cup Final on NHL radio in '94 with Sherry Ross, who does the Devils games on the radio. So just being in the building here in '94, having grown up here, and ironically, the Canucks were my favorite team as a youngster, along with
Really?
the Rangers. The Rangers were second. The Canucks were first.
How did that happen?
I have no idea. I think I must have liked the uniforms.
Kirk McLean.
Even before then.
Oh, their logo was amazing though.
Well,
in the mid-90s?
This is even before that, when they had the green and blue, the rink, the skate, which they've gone back to. Then they went to the yellow.
I was going to say, you got impressed by the V?
But it was even before the V.
Before the
I
V,
had
V,
I had the V jersey. I had all the jerseys.
Wow.
But this was back in the Stan Smeal, Thomas Gradine, Harold Snepps days of the Canucks. But anyway, by '94, I wanted to see the Rangers win that series. Having grown up in this building, they hadn't won in 54 years. So I'll have to be honest, I was not rooting for the Canucks in '94. So that's a highlight. The Stanley Cup run the Rangers made in 2014. One advantage to radio is we go all the way through. The TV guys only work the first round. So along with Dave Maloney, we've had some tremendous runs here in the playoffs. In 2012, conference final, 2014 Stanley Cup, 2015 conference final again. So I'd have to put that one up there. I've had the opportunity to work 4 Olympics now for NBC, men's and women's hockey. Did some of the women's gold medal games, some of the big men's games. Was in the building for the Crosby goal. Wasn't working the game, but was in the building in 2010 in Vancouver.
Wow.
So those 4 Olympics for sure. Salt Lake City, Torino, Vancouver, and Sochi. And then some of the NBC playoff games the last 4 or 5 years for sure. Conference finals, working LA-Chicago Game 7 in 2014, and conference finals last year out west with San Jose and St. Louis. So, the playoff games certainly, the Stanley Cup finals on the radio side in '94, '95, and again last year, those are up there as well.
And that's just hockey?
That's just hockey.
How do you have someone scheduling your dates? Because like you check your Twitter and it's like day 14, straight days calling this game.
Right.
I'm like, this is impressive. This is amazing.
As far as having a secretary or something like that, not really. I find that it works out a lot better if you keep track of that stuff on your own. And I mean, there are people that do the travel, whether Fox or NBC or MSG, that set up the travel for us, but I'm sort of telling them which flights I want to go on, what time I want to go. My schedule's like a jigsaw puzzle, and all 3 networks that I work for are really great about it. During the early portion of the Rangers season, when football is taking place, Don LaGreca does those Ranger games on the radio with Dave, and then I also fill in on some Knicks games on the TV side for MSG. And then during the playoffs, again, it's a jigsaw puzzle between NBC and MSG. So, and Fox couldn't be nicer about leaving the baseball schedule somewhat clean during the hockey playoffs as well. So it all seems to work out.
It's like a full-time job in itself to complete that jigsaw puzzle. Did you know that there's a website online that has counted how many broadcast partners you've worked with?
Well,
I don't know if this is confirmed. I'm just saying it exists.
There's a list that I have, and I know a writer through the Fox PR department. They did a story on it last year.
Okay.
And I've seen some of the other stuff on the internet. So I think it's between 250 and 300.
That's incredible. So, not to put you on the spot, because I mean it's difficult to name names, but do any other than the Rangers,
right.
Let's just leave that because they're the obvious choices, but are there others that come to mind that really stick out for you?
Absolutely, and I've been really lucky. I can't think of one that I did not enjoy working with, no matter what the sport is. But there are certain, Hall of Famers in their respective sports that are just always so much fun to work with. I have the opportunity to work 20 or 22 Knicks games a year with Clyde Frazier here in New York.
Do you ever try to outdress him?
Never. And I'm always aware of the fact that it doesn't matter what I'm wearing on the game open when we first come on the air, because nobody's looking at me. They're all looking at Clyde. There are websites and folks on Twitter and Instagram. There's a site called Clyde So Fly where they'll take a picture every game of what Clyde's wearing off the TV screen, and they'll put it out there, and they give him a grade from A+ all the way down to D. I don't think he's ever gotten a D or an F, but they'll grade him every game. In football, I've worked the last 10 years with Moose Johnston, who's a 3-time Super Bowl champion, so he's been my regular partner, but I've also had the opportunity to work games with Troy Aikman and Joe Namath and Howie Long and Terry Bradshaw, and I know I'm forgetting some guys, but a number of Hall of Famers, and they're all just so much fun to work with. And in baseball, same thing, worked probably 50 games with Tim McCarver, who's probably the greatest baseball announcer of all time. I've worked with Hall of Famers, Paul Molitor and Bert Blyleven, and Joe Girardi has been the manager of the Yankees for the last 10 years. So it's just so much fun, guys that I watched growing up and called their games, and then you have the opportunity to work with them.
Paul Molitor, near and dear to my heart as a Toronto guy.
One game with Paul Molitor in Minnesota. And you know what was cool? You know what was cool about that? He didn't do a lot of broadcasting. Fox would, about 10 years ago, they would sometimes use the local guys or players, affiliated with those teams. So the game I was working with Paul Molitor, Harmon Killebrew, the late Harmon Killebrew, actually came into the booth. He was at the game, a Hall of Fame player. And Paul Molitor, Harmon Killebrew was Paul Molitor's idol when he was growing up in Minnesota. And just to see one Hall of Famer so excited to be around another was just so much fun. You could just tell Paul was like a little kid, and here he is, 3,000 hits, world champion, Hall of Famer. But he was like a little kid in the presence of Harmon Killebrew. That's
amazing. So what has been that moment for you? I saw a picture of you and Vin Scully online. I don't think you've ever worked with him, I'm guessing. Two play-by-play guys.
I have a great story about that one, too. You're right. Never worked with him. Had never really met him. I had been around him. I had seen him in the press box. I had worked a number of Dodger games through the years, but never really had a conversation with him. And this was last August, and it was coming down to the end of his final season. And a friend of mine who used to work here at the Garden, actually, who's out in L.A. and knows Vin pretty well, he's worked with him behind the scenes. I asked him, I said, hey, do you think there's any chance I could take a quick picture with Vin Scully? And he said, let me check with his people in the booth. And they were on a pretty tight schedule. And they said, you'll be here tomorrow, right? And I was going to be working the game the next day. Come in at 10:40, he'll have 5 minutes. And that's how they scheduled before every game, because there were so many people that wanted to meet him and spend time. So they would have 5-minute intervals.
So just to put this into perspective, how many years had you been in the industry when this conversation occurred?
26.
Outstanding.
As a professional.
Wow.
So they said, come in at 10:40, he'll have 5 minutes, we'll take a picture. So I go in, he could not have been nicer, acted as if he had known me for years. And I said to him, I have to ask you one question. It's not going to be similar to any question I'm sure you've gotten during these last couple of months. I had seen an interview that Vin did with Bob Miller, the voice of the LA Kings, another Hall of Famer, and they talked hockey. And Vin mentioned that as a youngster, he would go to Ranger games at the old Madison Square Garden. So we took the photo, this is last August, and I said, I have one question for you. I said, I do the radio for the Rangers back in New York. I heard your interview with Bob Miller where you mentioned going to Ranger games as a high school student. What do you remember, if anything? He rattled off 4 or 5 names as if he were prepared for the question. He said, I can't do a Vin Scully imitation like some others can, but he said, I used to go to games at the old Garden and I would watch Brian Hextall and Davey Kerr and Lester Patrick, and he named 2 others off the top of his head. These are names he might not have heard or referenced in 30 years, and it was right at the spur of the moment.
That's awesome. I love hearing that.
It was so tremendous.
Great. Yeah, I bet. Did you show? Oh, I guess we were on the radio. I was going to say, did you show the picture? But
you know what? I sent out a tweet actually that day regarding Vin Scully and his Ranger memories and the players that he mentioned. And I actually got a message on Twitter from Leah Hextall, who does some broadcasting, who's, I guess she would be Brian Hextall's granddaughter or great-granddaughter, one of the players he mentioned from that 1940 Rangers team.
That's really cool. So let's broaden the conversation then. I mean, you are, as the internet says, and I believe this is true, the only current broadcaster to do all 4 major sports right now.
Right. As far as I know, the only current. There have been others. I'm not sure about within the span of the same year, but I know there are at least 10 or 15 others who have done all 4, NHL, NFL, NBA, MLB, at different times, but I'm really not sure if anyone's done it all in one year.
Which one's the toughest to call?
To me, baseball is the most challenging. Whenever I get the question, people think the answer would be hockey as far as the toughest. To me, it's the easiest. Maybe because I've done it for so long, but it's just a continuous flow, especially on radio. Now, the players are changing on the fly, and again, to me, that's second nature. It's like riding a bike. To others, it would probably be the toughest. So hockey's just a continuous flow. Basketball is similar, although there are more whistles, more stoppages in basketball. Football is probably the most structured. It's one play, 30 seconds. One play, 30 seconds. So I call the play, color analyst comes in, then I set up the next play. It's a routine. Baseball, the ball's actually in play for only 8 to 12 minutes per game. So
yeah, how crazy
if you're on the air for 3 hours, you might have 40 minutes of commercials, but that's another 2 hours where you have to kill the time. So I think in baseball, just like in the other sports, but in particular in baseball, you really have to have a good color analyst who's a storyteller, who knows the game, the strategy. So to me, that's the most challenging, and probably because I've done fewer baseball games than the number in the other sports.
And this is not taking anything away from the other sports, but do you have to have the most preparation for a baseball game simply because of that time to fill?
That's a good question. The most preparation by far is football.
Is it?
And during the football season, if I'm not sleeping, eating, doing something with my family, or working a hockey game, you're preparing for that next football game. Could be 6, 8, 10 hours a day. Watching prior games, reading articles, preparing charts. For whatever reason, just because of the nature of the sport, it's one game a week, it's a national game, every game's so big. You might be doing teams. I had the Atlanta Falcons week 17 this past season. I hadn't done a Falcons game all year. Every Falcons fan watching has watched almost every Falcons game. So you have to know as much as they do, if not more. And you have to catch up. You have to play catch up. So
what's your preparation like? Give me, so you're 6 to 10 hours a day, you're watching every game.
A football week's crazy. 17 weeks. Basically on a Monday morning you start. Now, it's a lot different than it used to be. When I started out, there was no satellite TV. You couldn't tape the games yourself. We'd have to wait until Wednesday to get VHS copies of both teams' prior games in the mail, FedEx, UPS, whatever it was. And also when I started doing football in '94, you would have articles faxed to you over a fax machine. There was no internet then. Now at the click of a button, you can read every article out there. I can tape the games at home and watch them Sunday night if I wanted to off DirecTV. So starting on Monday morning, you're preparing charts, spotting boards, reading every article that's written about the two teams, watching their prior games, like I said. And then for a football game, we go in on Friday morning, and we go to the home team practice, and we'll watch practice, and then we'll have these meetings with players and coaches, 5 or 6 guys we'll sit down with, head coach, coordinator, quarterback, players, anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes each. And we'll do the same thing with the visiting team when they get in on Saturday. So it's a really comprehensive weekend. There's obviously preparation in the other sports, but it's not nearly what it is. You know, in hockey or basketball, teams are playing 4 games a week. You're around them all the time. You're at practices. You're traveling with the team. So it's a little different as far as the preparation goes.
How many pages of notes would you have for a football game?
Well, at the beginning of the week, I probably have a pretty big stack of papers to go through and different publications and statistics. Once Sunday comes, though, it's all narrowed down onto this big 11 by 17 cardboard, double-sided. Then I have another sheet. You don't want to have too much in front of you during the game. So you also you probably only use 10% of it, of the information that you have. It's there just in case, but you really have to let the game dictate what you talk about.
I know when I was interviewing Dave in here, you were flipping through your notes on your iPad. How much of your preparation these days is paper versus iPad?
It's a combination. Again, for hockey, once the game starts, I have this actual cardstock sheet in front of me with all of my notes and information. But a lot of the work that I do leading up to that is on the iPad, reading. We get newspaper clippings sent to us from the Rangers every day, from another service where you could read articles about every team. There are statistics that are available out there. So a lot of the prep work is done on the iPad, but then once the game starts, it's on paper. But I have the iPad there as well, just in case I have to check anything.
How often do you have a statistician with you in the booth?
For football, you have a statistician and a spotter, which is very important in that sport. In baseball, you kind of keep scoring your own, but you do have a statistician there on TV games that they're feeding you certain pieces of information, also coordinating with the truck graphics and things of that nature. Basketball, it's important to have a statistician, even though you have a stats monitor. They're keeping streaks and runs, for example. Hockey, not as much. For TV games, we have a statistician, and they're feeding me different pieces of info, how many shots on a power play, face-offs. Radio, we used to have a stats guy, but now all you really need for a radio hockey broadcast is right in front of you on the iPad or the computer, so it's not as essential on hockey.
So for those, and we're digging deep into the broadcast play-by-play role here, but I think our audience would appreciate this. Give us the differences calling a game on the radio versus TV.
That's a great question, too. It's a lot different. On the radio, you have to describe everything. the listener can't see the game. So is the puck in the near corner, far corner, red line, blue line, near circle, far circle? There are just so many ways to describe what's going on the ice. On TV, you definitely pull back and don't have to describe as much. You have more space to let your color analysts come in. It's really the same thing in all sports. Radio is definitely an art form that is so valuable in the early days of learning how to become a play-by-play broadcaster. If you could do radio, you could definitely do TV, but not vice versa. Not all TV guys could do radio, but all radio guys could probably make the shift to TV.
I guess it's going back to that 10% preparation thing, right? Like you're not saying as much on TV as you are.
Right, that's part of it. That's part of it for sure.
Interesting.
And it's funny, I get, especially during the playoffs, people tell me, how exciting the Ranger game sounded on the radio, and I think part of it's just the nature of the radio broadcast. You sound more excited, you're talking faster, the play is moving faster on the radio, I think, for the play-by-play announcer than it is on the TV side.
Okay, let me ask you this, because you have succeeded in all 4 major sports and others. I mean, you do track and field in the Summer Olympics. I mean, you've done a lot, right? And there's 2 schools of thought in terms of making it in broadcasting in 2017. One is to be a generalist, right? Like to know a little bit about every sport. But the other one that I've heard a lot as well is become an expert in one field. Right? Like if you're going to be a hockey broadcaster, know everything about hockey and pretty much ignore every other sport. So if you're talking to aspiring broadcasters today, what do you tell them regarding that?
Well, I've always enjoyed the variety personally. And again, as I mentioned earlier, my goal initially was hockey. That was it. And then football opened up and that led to baseball, and did some basketball early on, not as much as the other sports, and now do it on a pretty regular basis. But the advice I always give to kids, and I speak to hundreds of high school and college students every summer at 3 or 4 different broadcasting camps, is to get as much experience as possible. I know some folks that age focus more on studio work, such as a Sports Center, ESPN anchor. But for those who want to go into play-by-play, I would advise to get as much experience as possible in different sports, because you never know what opportunities might come up.
So definitely do as many different sports for the play-by-play position.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. So when you were getting into these other sports, so you established yourself in hockey, and then all of a sudden football came up. Did you find it difficult to earn clout among those fans? Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I was so young at the time, and the Fox philosophy back then in '94 was to put together these 3 veteran groups and then 3 young teams of broadcasters. I think, part of what may have helped back then is there was no social media and there weren't as many critics out there. So we were able to do our jobs, and we were all on lower level crews. I worked 10 games the first year in the NFL. 3 of them were LA Rams games that weren't even sold out, so they weren't on in LA. They didn't go to a big portion of the country. So I think that was a great proving ground as well, those first few years, because the games weren't national games, so there was not a huge microscope on us. We got to kind of dig in our heels working the games that went to only 2 or 5% of the country for those first few years.
So is that another piece of advice? Like if you can get some reps where there's not much attention on that team per se, make your mistakes there, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, if someone has the opportunity to start right at the top, I'm not going to tell them not to, for sure. But
I'd find that stressful. I mean, if imagine being thrust into that limelight immediately.
But having the opportunity to work in the American Hockey League, as I did for the 2 years, and then work those lower, even though they were NFL games, it was a little different than it is now. These days, you can watch any game on DirecTV, on satellite. Back then, you had to be in one of those markets. And like I said, the games I was working in 94, 95, 96 weren't going to very large pockets of the country. So it probably was a benefit as far as the experience and the reps back then.
I know that you mentioned you wanted to be a hockey guy, right? A hockey broadcaster. But isn't it interesting that basketball may be the least on your resume in terms of the sports that you do, whereas basketball is so prevalent in the family?
Right. That's kind of ironic. But for whatever reason, hockey was the way, that I sort of leaned towards as a youngster. I just liked hockey the best, and That was just the way that I wanted to go. And now having the opportunity to do some basketball, it's a lot of fun here at MSG, working with Walt Frazier and the Knicks crew. So I do about 20 games a year, like I mentioned earlier. But I guess it's personal preference, and for me, it was hockey as a youngster as far as the main focus.
All right, Kenny, now the moment that every listener's been waiting for. Let's talk about your time on Juwanna Mann. All right. I want to know everything about it. How did you get cast as yourself? How did you get a part of this movie? Let's hear it all.
There is a lot behind the scenes that you can't even imagine when I think back to Juwanna Mann, involving travel and lost luggage.
Seriously?
Yes. So I had...
How did this come up? Was it like your agent calls and says,
yes.
Hey, okay.
Yep. So I had been in one other movie prior to that as an announcer, as a broadcaster.
Game Day, right?
Game Day. And it's funny because you just asked about the basketball. Both movies I've been in, I was cast as a basketball announcer, even though basketball was not my main sport. Game Day was a movie that never made it to the theater, went right to video. And Richard Lewis, who's actually been a family friend, my father and Richard had done some work together, so I've known him since I was in high school or college. And he's become a really good friend of mine as well. And listeners may be aware of Richard's work from Curb Your Enthusiasm and some of the other shows he's been in through the years. He was the star of Game Day. He was a Pat Riley type basketball coach, and I was the broadcaster. And that was filmed in one day here in New York, or at least my part was filmed in one day, and never made it to the big screen, but that was a lot of fun. A couple of years later, through my agent at the time, wound up with the role in Juwanna Mann with Chris Myers, who's another broadcaster at Fox, Jeannie Zelasco, who was a broadcaster at Fox at the time. We were all hired to be part of the crew for this movie, which was being filmed in Charlotte. And Vivica Fox was the star. There were a number of NBA players in the movie. And the premise was that it was about a basketball player who was thrown out of the league and wound up coming back as a player in the women's league, dressed up. A man dressed up as a woman, come back and play in this women's professional basketball league. So I was involved in a couple of scenes right at the start, and that was it. But we were filming it.
Which is great, because if people are like, I don't want to watch this movie, your part's already done.
Right, my part was over.
So they saw Kenny. Great.
Exactly. So I think it was a Tuesday morning, and they told me to bring 2 suits and 4 dress shirts, extra clothes just in case, for the filming. And the filming was going to begin at like 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. So I go to the airport, and for some reason, I'm a much more experienced traveler now. If it were today, I would have carried on with me at least one of the suits and 1 or 2 of the shirts in my carry-on luggage. For some reason, I decided to check my luggage that day. Mm-hmm. This was before suitcases on wheels, when you actually had to carry the suitcase on your shoulder.
The horror.
And it would kill your back. So for some reason, I checked my bag with all my clothing in it, and it was a clear day. It was about 4 o'clock at LaGuardia on a Monday. And as I'm waiting to board the plane, these torrential storms come in all of a sudden. It wasn't expected. And now the flights start getting delayed and pushed back and canceled. And I'm thinking, A, I have to get to Charlotte for tomorrow morning. B, what if my clothes don't get there? I get the last seat on the last flight out. I land about midnight, filming 7 a.m. No luggage. Luggage doesn't make it. Oh, so now I don't know what to do. I have no razor. I have no solution for my contact lenses at the time. No clothing except for what I'm wearing. I had the taxi take me to a 24-hour CVS just to pick up a toothbrush and a razor. So at this point, they were picking us up at like 5 a.m. So I sleep 4 hours. I don't have any clothes, so I throw on what I had on to travel the day before. I get there. Fortunately, one of the other gentlemen had some extra suit jackets and shirts. So I'm wearing the pants that I had worn down, the socks, the underwear. That might be too much information.
It's good.
But everything that I wore down the night before on the flight, I borrow a shirt, tie, and sport jacket, and we filmed Juwanna Mann.
See, now we can never watch the movie the same again. No. Now we'll know that Kenny Albert wore the same underwear that he traveled into the movie.
True story.
In the movie.
And then I go back to the airport. We finish up in like 3 hours, go back for a noon flight. There's my luggage that had just arrived, going around the carousel. I picked it up, took it on the next flight, got home. I had never even unpacked the suitcase. So that's my memory of Juwanna Mann.
Man. Juwanna luggage is what it should have been, yeah. All right, let's end on this, Kenny. What have you not called that you want to call?
Well, I've been really fortunate at Arda. We talked about Stanley Cup finals and Olympics and hockey all-star games. In football, I've had the fortune to work 5 divisional playoff games, 4 BCS bowl games for Fox. And I did work 1 Super Bowl for the international feed. So it wasn't on in the U.S., but it was the international broadcast with Joe Theismann. The ultimate goal would be to work a Super Bowl in the U.S. On one of the networks. Aside from Stanley Cup finals, which I've been a part of, 1 game on TV and 4 different finals on the radio. Baseball playoffs, I've worked for Fox the last couple of years. Did some Knicks playoff games a few years ago. So I guess the ultimate would be the Super Bowl in our profession. So like I said, had the opportunity to do it on the international side. Got a little bit of the flavor of it, but that would certainly be the ultimate goal.
Unequivocally the biggest role that any broadcaster could have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, like I said, been so fortunate to be involved in all sports, whether it's the Stanley Cup playoffs, Stanley Cup final, unbelievable baseball playoffs. You mentioned the Blue Jays.
Yes.
I was involved in that crazy series 2 years ago with Texas. The Bautista home run.
Yes.
The
of course, the bat
wild
flip.
7th inning, the bat flip. So I was part of that one
That was
as
so
well.
crazy. ESPN aired an hour special just on that 7th inning.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, unlike anything we've seen in baseball, yeah. What about sports? Any sports you haven't done that you want to try? Or does it even matter at this point? Because I mean,
at this point, not really.
Maybe another crack at college wrestling.
Another crack at college wrestling, perhaps. You mentioned track and field. That was a lot of fun. I had never done any track and field and was involved at the Olympics for NBC. Worked some horse racing for Fox about 15 years ago. Didn't actually call the races. I was the host of a show, a 1-hour show around some of the big races. So those are different. You're out of your element, but a lot of fun to learn and meet the people who are involved in those sports. But as far as an actual sport that I haven't been involved in, probably can't think of one. Maybe a cricket match someday overseas. Wow. Who knows? One
thing I would like to do with you, I definitely want you back on this podcast.
Anytime.
And what I would like to do is sit in the press room and do play-by-play of what's happening in the press room. We'll do that before a game one day.
That would be fun. That would be fun for sure.
Kenny, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Arda.
So thank you very much to Kenny Albert for graciously giving us so much time for that conversation on the A-Pod. I am definitely going to go and watch Juwanna Mann again. I hope that you do that as well. Maybe the next time we bring Kenny on, we can just do like a alternate commentary on his scene. Now that you know the story behind him filming that scene. That's hilarious, by the way. I mean, that's one of the best stories we've heard on this podcast. So thank you to Kenny for that. And thank you very much for listening. We're going to be back on Friday. Yes, a bonus edition of the A-Pod, I promise you. On Friday, we will have another edition of the A-Pod, and here's a hint. It's going to be fashion-related, and I don't mean Paris, what color is in, that kind of thing. This is going to be, in layman's terms, this is going to be a great podcast to listen to if you're scared by the word fashion and you think you don't have any fashion sense. You're going to want to tune into this one because the guest we have on Friday will completely put you at ease with your own personal style, and you'll be making slight changes that will improve your look immediately. And there are a couple of actionable items in the podcast that our guest tells us that are phenomenal. I've been using them, and my mind is blown, and I am so happy that her and I spoke and had that conversation on the A-Pod, because I definitely do those suggestions and have incorporated them into my game, and you definitely will too. So once again, thank you very much to Kenny Albert for joining us here on the A-Pod. Be sure to join us on Friday at msgnetworks.com and on iTunes and Google Play and other podcatchers. This has been another edition of the A-Pod. Thank you very much, and we will see you on Friday. Wait, we will join you again on Friday. You will hear us on Friday. Yeah, that's better. And you will hear us on Friday. Yeah.